Forgive me for commandeering someone else's story here, but I think it's very relevant to the thread, and although my father wasn't a trucker, this incident closely involves someone who was. Back in the 70s, my dad was an 18-year-old gas station attendant at a 24-hour gas station. One night, Dad was the only one working the late shift when one of the sketchiest customers he'd ever laid eyes on walks into the station. My dad said it was really obvious that the guy was concealing something in his pants, and his first thought, which brings on some major panic, is that the guy has a gun on him. Now, a whole lot of truck drivers used to use his station for two reasons. Number one, it had a pretty roomy parking lot which they'd use to take naps and breaks in, and number two, it was the only place for miles around that they could get a bite to eat. Usually, there could have been up to 10 truckers parked up in the lot, but on this particular night, there was only one truck there. Luckily, though, the guy just so happened to be in the store with my dad, but since Dad didn't know if he was armed or what kind of guy he was, he figured he was still pretty vulnerable. The weird guy starts walking up and down the rows in the store, and my dad can tell he's not really looking at anything. Most customers either come in to pay for their gas or went straight to the hot food counter to pick out something to eat. Weird guy looks like he's just biding his time before he pulls out his gun and robs the store. At least that's what's going through my dad's head. The trucker comes up to the counter while this is happening, puts down a bag of chips, and just so happens to look over his shoulder at the sketchy guy. Then, this moment of pure understanding occurs. The trucker looks at the sketchy guy, then looks at my dad, then back and forth maybe once or twice more, then asks my dad what was supposed to sound like a totally random question. He says something like, "Quiet night, huh? I wouldn't feel safe working at a gas station alone. You keep a gun behind the counter there or something?" All my dad had was a bat, and even so, it belonged to the station's owner, but the trucker widens his eyes and mimes a nod at my dad, who suddenly realizes what he's supposed to say in reply. "Oh yeah," he says. "I got a 45 right here. Always just in arms like the way." The trucker continues to play along and bangs his fist on the counter before kind of shielding the action with his body. "Oh yeah?" he says. "Well, check this out. 357 Magnum. Bought it after I saw that movie, Dirty Harry. Not as big a bullet as your 45, but it sure does pack a punch. Some days I just pray some SOB mess with me so I can blow his freaking head off." Right as he says that, the sketchy guy just makes a beeline for the door, gets back into his car, then zooms off down the highway. When the guy had left, the trucker turns back to my dad and says something along the lines of, "You know that guy was about to rob you, right? I was going to take a nap out back, but I think I'm more in the mood for coffee after that. Oh, and do yourself a favor. Call the cops." My dad says he always figured guardian angels would be all cherubic, half-naked winged ladies that descend playing harps or whatever. He didn't figure they came in the form of some hairy trucker who smelled like he hadn't showered in 3 days. But as he puts it, every day is a school day. The guy spent the entire rest of his break hanging around the store, making conversation with my dad until the cops showed up and my dad could file a report. The trucker confirmed the story too, backing my dad up when he said it looked like the sketchy guy had a gun stuffed in the back of his pants. Then get this, right in the middle of talking to the cops, both of their radios start buzzing, and they run out of the gas station, get into the patrol car, and speed off down the highway with their lights and sirens on. The trucker responds, "I hope our friend and his gun didn't find the trouble they were looking for." Only, they had. My dad said he read in the newspaper the next day that the very same guy, based on the description in the paper, had walked into another gas station about 10 miles down the highway. But unlike my dad, the clerk in that station hadn't been so lucky. The guy was the actual owner and operator of the station, tried to resist the robbery, and ended up paying with his life. From what my dad could tell, the sketchy guy pulled his gun, the station owner went for his, and the sketchy guy just pulled the trigger. Boom. Killed him behind his own counter. Now, my dad obviously didn't have a gun, but he said he was panicking just watching the guy walking around the store. If that was him getting robbed by someone with such an itchy trigger finger, he might have made a wrong move or something and bam. I literally wouldn't even be around today to write this. I think the sketchy guy ended up getting the death penalty too. That or died in some shootout with the cops. Maybe even the same cops who attended my dad's call. I can't quite remember which, but Dad always mentions him getting what he deserved whenever he tells the story. Now, I don't have to tell you how glad I am of that too, because even though it's so surreal to me, the idea of someone actually hurting my dad is just on a whole other kind of rage that I would feel. Dad's story doesn't just give me a belief in guardian angels, even if they do appear in unconventional forms, but it also makes me believe that there might just be something like divine justice, too.
My name is Uriel. This happened to me in Mexico. I would visit my grandmother and my aunt. I would usually go to check on my grandmother, and I would help her out with some chores that my aunt couldn't do, like yard work or things that had to do with heavy lifting. One day I was going over to see my grandmother and to see if my aunt needed help with anything. As I unlocked the door and entered the house, it was quiet, which was odd as my aunt and grandma would play music or have the TV on. Both are off, and I looked around the house to see if I could find my aunt or grandma, but I couldn't find them. But I didn't look in my grandma's room. How do I spit in my grandmother's privacy? I knocked on the door, but no answer. I knocked a second time, but it was quiet. I opened the door to see if she was sleeping. As I opened the door, I saw a lady dressed all in black, with her long black hair over her face. She was sitting on my grandma's bed on the edge of the bed. I didn't know who she was. I asked her, "Who are you?" She remained quiet. I asked again, "Who are you and how did you get in here?" The doors were locked and all the windows had bars, which made it impossible for someone to enter the house. I went outside to the shed to get my machete, which I used to cut the branches in the backyard. I was hoping to use it to threaten her so she would leave, but as soon as I entered the room, she was gone. I heard the front door opening. I went to see and found my grandmother and aunt coming back from a walk. My grandmother and aunt saw me and asked me why I had the machete out. I said, "There was somebody in your room, Grandma." I told them to stay where they were while I looked around the house to see if the lady was still there. About an hour goes by. I couldn't find nobody. I told them to come back inside. They asked me if I found anything. I said no. The only trace of her being there was the imprint of her sitting on my grandmother's bed. I decided to spend the night to make sure they were safe. A few days passed. Nothing happened until the next day. My grandmother passed away in her sleep. We held a funeral for her a few days after, but I couldn't stop thinking about the lady in black. I told my aunt about it. Her face was pale as soon as I told her everything. She told me what I saw was the lady in black. She is an omen of death. She's unknown if she's a spirit or demon, but she was the reason of my grandmother passing.